Okay, here's the thing. Before all of this happened, my life was, for the first time, exactly what I wanted it to be. You have to understand that part first, or none of the rest of it will make any sense. My name is In. I'm 24, and for the first 24 years of my life, I'd always lived with someone else. Parents, then a series of increasingly chaotic college roommates, and finally, a post-grad roommate who collected ceramic frogs and practiced the clarinet at 2 a.m. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so my home isn't just where I sleep, it's my office, my studio, my entire world. And for years, that world was full of noise I didn't make and messes I didn't create. So, 2 months ago, I did it. I signed a lease on my own place. It was on the third floor of an old, reddish brick apartment building. Not fancy, you know, but solid. The kind of place with thick walls and a slightly musty smell in the hallways that told you it had been standing for a long time. My apartment, 3B, was small. A little living room that bled into a tiny kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. But it was clean. The landlord had put in new laminate floors that looked like light oak, and the walls were a fresh, anonymous white. It was a blank canvas. And it was all mine. I remember the first night, sitting on the floor because my furniture hadn't arrived yet, eating takeout pizza from the box, and just listening to the silence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The distant hum of traffic from the street below, the occasional creak of the building settling. That was it. No clarinet, no passive-aggressive notes about the dishes. Just me and my own space. I felt this incredible sense of peace settle over me. This was my sanctuary, my fortress, the one place on earth where I was in complete control, where nothing could get in unless I allowed it to. Looking back on that feeling now, it's almost laughable how wrong I was. The irony is so thick it could choke you. My days fell into a comfortable rhythm. I'd wake up, make coffee in my own quiet kitchen, and sit at the small desk I'd set up by the big window in the living room. I'd work on logos for a new startup or a website layout for a local bakery, losing myself in pixels and color palettes. In the afternoons, I'd walk to the small grocery store 3 blocks away, get what I needed for dinner, and walk back. It was a simple, quiet, independent life. It was perfect. The day it all started was a Tuesday. It was late afternoon, that time when the sun starts to get low and golden, casting long shadows. I was walking home from the grocery store, 1 plastic bag in each hand, the handles digging into my fingers a little. I was on my usual route, a quiet, tree-lined street I'd walked down 100 times already. I was probably thinking about what font to use for a client project, or whether I had enough cilantro for the tacos I was planning to make. Total, blissful normalcy. And then I saw it. It was sitting on the grass, right next to the gnarled base of a big oak tree. It was a box, a small wooden box, maybe about the size of a shoebox for a child's pair of shoes. It wasn't just any box, though. Even from a few feet away, I could see it was special. The wood was dark, rich, like mahogany or walnut, and it was covered in these incredibly intricate carvings. Swirls and vines and things that looked like tiny, sleeping faces, all flowing into one another. It looked old, genuinely old, not like something you'd buy at a home decor store. As a designer, my brain immediately lit up. I appreciate craftsmanship, the time and skill something like this takes. It was beautiful. I stopped. The grocery bags suddenly felt heavy. I looked up and down the street. It was empty. No one was around, no one who might have just dropped it. It was just sitting there, perfectly placed, as if it were waiting. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over, setting my groceries down on the sidewalk. Up close, it was even more stunning. The wood was smooth under my fingertips, worn down by time. There was no lock, no visible hinges, just a perfect seam where the lid met the base. And then I saw the note. It was a small, rectangular piece of paper, yellowed and torn from a notepad. It was taped to the very center of the lid with a piece of old, browning Scotch tape. On it, written in a messy, black ink scrawl, were 2 words. Don't open. That's it. No explanation, no name, just that simple, clear command. The handwriting wasn't elegant, it was sloppy, a little shaky, like someone had written it in a hurry. Or in fear. A little shiver went through me, the kind you get when you're watching a horror movie. It was weird, genuinely weird. My rational brain, the one that paid my bills and remembered to lock my door, kicked in immediately. Walk away, and this is strange. It's not yours. It could be anything. Leave it alone. But there was another voice, the designer voice, the artist voice. The part of me that had been bored by roommates and routine for years. But it's so beautiful, what could possibly be in it? It's probably just a kid's prank, or some kind of game, like a geocache. The note, instead of scaring me off, had the opposite effect. It was a hook. It turned a beautiful object into a mystery. What kind of person leaves a work of art on the sidewalk with a warning? I stood there for what felt like a long time, having this silent debate with myself. The logical part of me knew the right thing to do. The safe thing, just pick up my groceries and go home to my quiet, controlled sanctuary. Forget I ever saw it. But it was so compelling. The perfect lines, the dark wood, the stark, desperate-looking warning. I thought about how it would look on my desk, next to my monitor. A piece of history, a conversation starter, a little piece of mystery right in my own home. In the end, curiosity won. It always does, doesn't it? I told myself it was fine. I picked it up. It had a surprising weight to it, solid and dense. I tucked it under my arm, grabbed my groceries, and walked the rest of the way home, my heart beating just a little bit faster than normal. I felt a little thrill, like a kid who had just shoplifted a candy bar, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I found it, finders keepers. Back in the safety of my apartment, I locked the deadbolt behind me. That satisfying, heavy clunk that always made me feel secure. I put the groceries away in my tiny kitchen, my mind entirely on the box. Then, I brought it over to my desk and set it down in the pool of light from my lamp. It looked even better in here, a dark, organic shape against the clean white of my desk. A perfect contrast. Okay, now to solve the mystery. I sat down, pulled it closer, and examined it again. The words, "Don't open," seemed almost accusatory under the direct light. I peeled off the tape carefully. The paper underneath was brittle. I set it aside and focused on the lid. I tried to lift it. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the lid and the base were one solid piece of wood. I ran my fingernail along the seam, searching for a lip or an edge to get some purchase. There was nothing. The fit was perfect, seamless. I turned it over and over in my hands. No buttons, no hidden switches, no trick panels that I could find. I shook it gently next to my ear. Silence. Whatever was inside was either packed and tight, or there was nothing inside at all. Frustration started to replace the initial excitement. It was like being given a present you weren't allowed to unwrap. I spent a good 20 minutes trying to figure it out, tapping it, pressing on the carvings, trying to slide the lid sideways. It was completely and utterly sealed. It was baffling. How was this even constructed? It defied logic. Eventually, I gave up. My tacos weren't going to make themselves. I pushed the box to the corner of my desk, a beautiful, frustrating, silent enigma. I made dinner, ate at my little kitchen counter, and cleaned up. I put on some music, answered a few work emails. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. My eyes kept drifting back to it. This strange object that had, in the space of an hour, inserted itself into my perfect, controlled world. It was a foreign element, an unknown variable. Later that night, I got ready for bed. I went through my whole routine, brushed my teeth, washed my face, changed into an old t-shirt. I turned off the lights in the living room and kitchen, leaving only the small lamp on my bedside table on. My apartment was quiet again, peaceful. I got into bed and turned off the last light. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the city filtering through my blinds. My eyes slowly adjusted. I could see the dark shapes of my furniture, the outline of the door. And through the bedroom doorway, I could see the living room. The moon was bright, and a single, sharp beam of it was slicing through the window, landing directly on my desk. It illuminated the box. In the pale, silvery light, the intricate carvings looked deeper, darker. The polished wood seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And even though I couldn't possibly read it from this distance, I knew exactly what was written on that little piece of paper I'd set beside it. I could see the words in my head, floating in the dark. Don't open. It didn't feel like a mystery anymore. It didn't feel like a game. Sitting there in the silent heart of my sanctuary, it felt like a warning. A whisper in a place that was supposed to be mine alone. And for the first time since finding it, a real, cold tendril of unease curled in the pit of my stomach. I pulled the covers up a little higher and told myself, firmly, that it was just a box. Just an old, strange, beautiful box. And I was being ridiculous. I'm a creature of habit. I think you have to be, when you work for yourself from home. Otherwise the days just kind of melt into each other. So, I have my little nightly ritual. Lock the door, the deadbolt first, then the knob. Check that the stove is off, even though I already know it is. Brush teeth, wash face, change into a worn-out gray t-shirt that's softer than anything else I own. It's a simple routine, but it's mine, and it signals the end of the day. It's the final wall I build between the world and my sanctuary before I go to sleep. That night, everything was the same. The satisfying clunk of the deadbolt sliding home felt heavy and final. The apartment was quiet. I mean, truly quiet. Not the fake quiet of a city that's just holding its breath, but the deep, peaceful silence of the third floor, late at night, with no roommates to worry about. It was a silence I had paid for, that I had earned, and I loved it. I turned off the living room lamp, and the only light left was the pale blue glow of my alarm clock on the bedside table. I slipped under the covers. The sheets were cool and clean. I remember just lying there for a minute, on my back, listening. The hum of the refrigerator was a low, comforting drone. Outside, a distant siren wailed for a second and then faded away. Nothing else. Perfect. This was my favorite part of the day. The moment where I was completely, utterly safe. Where I was in control. I rolled onto my side, facing the door to my bedroom, my eyes starting to feel heavy. I was somewhere in that fuzzy, pleasant space between awake and asleep, when my thoughts start to lose their sharp edges and drift. And that's when I heard it. Scritch, scratch. It was so quiet that at first, I wasn't even sure I'd heard anything at all. It could have been the fabric of my pillowcase against my ear. It was a tiny sound, dry and thin. I held my breath, my body freezing instantly. My sleepiness evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet. I was wide awake. Silence. The refrigerator hummed on. The digital clock on my nightstand flipped from 11:58 to 11:59 with a barely audible click. Nothing else. I strained my ears, listening so hard it felt like my eardrums were stretching. Where had it come from? It sounded close. It sounded like it was inside the apartment. My mind immediately jumped to the living room, to the desk by the window. To the box. No, I told myself, a little too forcefully. Don't be an idiot, and it's an old building. Buildings make noises. Wood creaks, pipes groan. That's all it was. It made sense. It was the only thing that did make sense. But the sound hadn't been a creak or a groan. It was specific. It was a scratching sound, like a single, sharp fingernail being dragged across a rough surface. And it was intermittent. A little scratch, then a pause. Another one, a bit longer. Scritch, scritch, scratch. Just like that, I slowly, carefully, pushed myself up into a sitting position. My heart was starting to beat a little faster now, a low, steady thumping against my ribs. The room was dark, but my eyes had adjusted enough to make out the basic shapes. The dresser against the wall. The open doorway leading out into the living room. Through that doorway, I could just see the corner of my desk, silhouetted against the faint orange glow of the streetlights outside. The box was there, a dark, rectangular lump in the shadows. I sat like that for what felt like an hour, but my clock told me was only about 4 minutes. Motionless, barely breathing, just listening, and there was nothing, absolute, total silence. My rational brain started fighting back against the panic. It was a mouse, it said. Of course, old building probably has mice in the walls. That's exactly what it sounded like. A mouse, scratching at the dry wall. The relief that washed over me was immediate and immense. A mouse. Why hadn't I thought of that before? It was a simple, logical, non-terrifying explanation. It was a little gross, sure. I'd have to call the landlord tomorrow. But it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some curse coming from the creepy box I'd brought into my home. It was just a small, furry pest. I could deal with that. I exhaled a long, slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Feeling a little foolish, I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes and tried to force my body to relax, to find that sleepy place again. Just a mouse in the wall. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, but the fear didn't completely go away. It had left behind a slimy residue. The sound had seemed so precise, and it didn't sound like it was coming from inside a wall. It sounded like it was coming from something on my desk. My eyes snapped open again. I was staring up at the blank white ceiling. My mind, against my will, kept replaying the sound. Scritch, scratch, and every time I heard it in my head, the image that came with it wasn't of a mouse. It was of that box. The dark wood, the intricate carvings of those screaming faces, the note that said, "Don't open." I had brought a warning into my sanctuary. What kind of an idiot does that? A part of me, a small, terrified part, wanted to get up, grab the box, run out of my apartment and throw it in the dumpster behind the building. But then what? What if it was nothing? I'd look like a crazy person, running out into the night in my pajamas to throw away a perfectly nice, if weird, antique box. I could just picture myself trying to explain it. Yeah, hi, I think this box is making noises. I'd sound insane, so I stayed in bed. I told myself I was being paranoid. The box was just a box. Wood and glue. The sound was just a mouse. A pest. The two things had nothing to do with each other. It was a coincidence. I rolled over, turning my back to the bedroom door, as if not being able to see the living room would somehow make it safer. I squeezed my eyes shut. I tried thinking about work projects, about color schemes and font pairings, about what I was going to have for lunch tomorrow. Anything to distract myself from the silence that now felt heavy and watchful. Anything to keep from listening for that sound again. It took a long, long time to fall asleep. My sleep was thin and restless, full of anxious dreams I couldn't remember when I woke up. But I did fall asleep, eventually, and then, hours later, in that deep, pre-dawn darkness, I heard it again. It wasn't a series of scratches this time. It was just one, a single, sharp skirt. It was quick, decisive, and right outside my bedroom door. Then, immediate silence. My eyes flew open in the pitch black. Every muscle in my body went rigid. There was no half-asleep confusion this time. There was no room for doubt. I had not imagined it. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't a mouse in the wall. It was real, and it was in my apartment. I didn't sleep. Not really. After that sharp, metallic sound from the living room, sleep wasn't an option. I just lay there, on my back, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid as a board. Every nerve was on fire. I was listening with an intensity that made my ears ache, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for a footstep, for the creak of a floorboard, for anything, but nothing came. The silence pressed back in, heavier than before, thick with something ugly and watchful. My rational mind, what was left of it, tried to offer explanations. A pipe contracting in the cold. The building settling, but I couldn't fool myself. The sound had been too precise, too deliberate. It was the sound of metal on metal, right near the door. My door. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. The stillness was worse than the noise. I had to move. I had to do something. Slowly, like an old woman, I swung my legs out of bed. My feet were cold on the wooden floor. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to see what might be waiting for me, but more than that, I didn't want to be seen. I crept to my bedroom doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I peeked around the corner. The living room was just a landscape of shadows, cut by the weak orange light from the street below. I could see the couch, the coffee table, the big window. And I could see my desk. The box was still there, a dark, solid shape. It seemed to pulse with a kind of quiet energy in the gloom. Everything looked normal, untouched, and then I heard it again. Scritch, scritch, scratch, scritch. It wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was coming from the desk, from the box, and it was different. It wasn't the tentative, exploratory scratching from the first night. This was more insistent, more frantic. It was a rhythmic, desperate sound, like a rat trapped in a tiny cage, clawing relentlessly at the walls, trying to dig its way out. Scratch, scritch, scratch. The sound went right through me, a high-pitched vibration that made the fillings in my teeth ache. All my half-baked theories about mice in the walls evaporated. That sound was coming from the box. There was no doubt now. Something was inside it, and it wanted out. A new kind of fear took over, hot and sharp. It wasn't just the passive terror of listening in the dark anymore. It was an active, angry fear. This thing, this object, had invaded my home, my sanctuary, and was taunting me. I was done being its audience. I snapped. I didn't think. I just acted. I stormed back into my bedroom, yanked open my desk drawer where I kept a small toolkit for assembling furniture, and grabbed the first thing my hand closed on. A Phillips head screwdriver. It felt heavy and solid in my hand. A weapon, a tool, something real in a situation that felt impossibly unreal. I went back into the living room, marching right up to the desk. The scratching continued, steady and maddening. Scritch, scratch, scritch. It was like it knew I was there, like it was daring me. Shut up, I whispered, my voice a ragged hiss. I wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the thin seam where the lid met the body of the box. The wood was incredibly dense, the craftsmanship perfect. There was barely a crack to get any leverage. I put my shoulder into it, gritting my teeth, trying to pry it open. The metal screwdriver scraped against the dark wood with a horrible shriek. My hand slipped, and the screwdriver gouged a long, ugly scratch in the polished varnish. But the box didn't budge. Not a millimeter. It was like it was carved from a single, solid block of wood. Open, I grunted, shoving again, all my frustration and terror channeling into this one stupid, physical act. The wood splintered a little around the edge, but the seal held. It was useless. I was just vandalizing it. Panting, I threw the screwdriver down on the desk. It clattered loudly in the silent apartment. The scratching stopped. Instantly, the sudden absence of the noise was somehow more deafening than the sound itself. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the box. It sat there, impassive, defiant, wearing the new scar I'd given it. I had to get it out of my house. Right now, I grabbed the box. It was surprisingly heavy, dense. I didn't care. I marched toward the large window in the living room, the one overlooking the alley 3 floors down. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking. I was going to throw it out. I was going to hurl it into the darkness and listen for the satisfying smash of it hitting the pavement. Let it scratch down there. Let it be someone else's problem. My hand was on the window sash. I was about to heave it up. And I stopped. A thought, cold and clear, cut through my panic. It wasn't a rational thought. It was something else, something deeper and more primal. What if that's what it wants? What if breaking it or throwing it away was the trigger? The note said, "Don't open." It didn't say, "Don't throw it in the trash." But what if the warning was more general? What if I was about to do something I couldn't take back? Make it angry? I looked down at the box in my hands. The carved faces seemed to sneer at me in the dim light. I felt like a character in a bad horror movie, the one who does the stupid thing everyone in the audience screams at them not to do. I couldn't do it. The fear of the unknown was greater than the fear of the known. At least with the box here, I knew where the threat was. I could watch it. Defeated, I lowered my hands. I walked back to the desk and placed the box back down, not in its original spot, but shoved into a corner, partly hidden behind my monitor. Like a naughty child being put in timeout. It was a pathetic, ridiculous gesture, and I knew it. I didn't go back to bed. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wrapped in a throw blanket, watching the first hint of gray light appear in the window. I didn't hear another sound from the box. I just sat and waited for the sun to come up, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. The next morning, I felt hungover from a lack of sleep and an overdose of adrenaline. The world outside my window, the sound of traffic, of a garbage truck grinding down the alley, seemed blessedly normal. In the harsh light of day, my fear felt, well, it still felt real, but it also felt slightly theatrical. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Stress, loneliness, and overactive imagination. I had to get out. I had a client meeting I couldn't miss. I got ready on autopilot, showered, dressed, grabbed my portfolio. All I wanted was to be somewhere else, somewhere public and loud and brightly lit. I went to the front door, keys in my hand. I was on autopilot, thinking about the presentation I had to give. I slid the key into the deadbolt, and my fingers brushed against the metal faceplate of the lock. I stopped. Something was wrong. I pulled my key out and looked closer. There, on the circular brass plate around the keyhole, was a scratch. It wasn't an old mark. It was new. It was a thin, silvery crescent gouged into the metal, bright and sharp against the dull, aged brass of the rest of the lock. It looked like it had been made by something hard and pointed. Something metal. My heart didn't just beat faster. It stopped. For a full second, it just seized up in my chest. I stared at the scratch. It was small, insignificant. Anyone else might not even notice it. But I knew my door. I locked and unlocked it every single day. I'd have noticed this. This was not there yesterday. My mind replayed the sound from the night before. The second sound, the one just before the scratching started again. That single, sharp skirt. The sound of metal on metal. No, my brain screamed the word. No, you're making connections that aren't there. You're losing it. I tried to rationalize it. I must have done it myself. Yesterday when I came home, tired, I must have fumbled with my keys and scraped the lock. Yes, that had to be it. It was the only explanation that didn't make me want to curl up into a ball and start screaming. I forced myself to believe it. I took a deep breath, shoved the key back in, turned it, and opened the door. I walked out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind me. I locked it again, carefully this time, my hand trembling slightly. But as I walked down the 3 flights of stairs and out onto the busy street, I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling of being violated. The box was one thing, a weird, creepy object that made noises. It was contained, but the scratch on the lock was something else entirely. It was a message. It meant the barrier between my safe little world and the one outside had been tested. Someone, or something, had stood right there, on the other side of my door, while I was inside. They had stood where I was standing now, and they had tried to get in. The entire day was a blur. I sat in a coffee shop before my meeting, trying to work, but I couldn't focus. Every time the bell over the door chimed, I jumped. Every person who walked past my table felt like a threat. My sanctuary had been breached, not just from the inside by some cursed object, but from the outside, too. That evening, coming home was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. The apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a cage. As I walked up the stairs, I imagined someone waiting for me in the shadowed hallway. I got to my door. I stared at the scratch on the lock for a long time before putting my key in. Inside, everything was as I had left it. The first thing I did was go to the desk. The box was still there, shoved in the corner where I'd put it. Silent, waiting. That night, I checked the locks on the front door 3 times. The deadbolt, the knob. I even dragged a heavy armchair from the living room and wedged its back under the doorknob, a trick I'd seen in movies. It looked pathetic. It felt pathetic, but I did it anyway. I didn't even try to go to bed. I turned off all the lights except for one small lamp in the living room. I sat on the couch, facing the front door. My eyes kept flicking from the door, with its barricade and its new, shiny scar, over to the desk in the shadows, where I knew the box was sitting. And it hit me, with a clarity that was more terrifying than anything else. I was trapped, not in the apartment, but between 2 fears. There was the thing in the box, the scratching, clawing thing that tormented me from the inside. And then there was the thing that had stood in the hallway, the thing that had left its mark on my lock, the thing that was trying to get in from the outside. I didn't know which one was worse, and I didn't know if they were connected. I just sat there in the quiet glow of the lamp, a sentry in my own living room, watching and waiting. My home had become the front line of a war one didn't understand, and I was stuck right in the middle of it. I sat on the couch for what felt like most of my life. I think it was probably 3 or 4 hours. The little lamp I'd left on threw long, distorted shadows across the living room, making familiar things look alien. The armchair I'd wedged under the doorknob looked like a hunched creature. My own reflection in the dark TV screen was a pale, hollow-eyed ghost. I just sat there, wrapped in a blanket, my knees pulled up to my chest, and I watched the door. One half of my brain was focused on the door, on the new, shiny scratch on the lock, on the pathetic barricade. The other half was hyper-aware of the corner of my desk, where the wooden box sat in the shadows. It was a strange kind of mental tug-of-war. I was caught between this very real, tangible fear of a person trying to get in, and this surreal, impossible fear of an object that seemed to be alive. I didn't know which was crazier. To be honest, I was starting to think the stress had finally broken me. Maybe there was no scratch. Maybe the sounds were just pipes. Maybe I was just a lonely woman in a new apartment, inventing a horror story to keep herself company. I almost managed to convince myself. I almost managed to breathe a little easier, to tell myself I'd feel foolish in the morning. And then the sound started. It wasn't the tentative scratching from the first night, or even the more insistent scraping from the night before. This was different. This was pure, undiluted panic. Scree 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 scritch scritch scritch. It was a frantic, high-pitched clawing, so fast and so furious that the individual sounds blurred into one continuous, agonizing shriek of wood and something else. It was the sound of a cornered animal, a rat in a trap, flinging itself against the walls of its prison with every last ounce of its strength. It was a sound of absolute desperation, and it was coming from the desk. From the box. The sound sliced right through my carefully constructed bubble of denial. It was so violent, so charged with a desperate energy, that I felt it in my bones. It was a sound that said, "This is it. This is the last chance. Let me out now." And something inside me snapped. I was done being scared. I was done being a prisoner on my own couch, listening to this thing have a tantrum. My fear, which had been cold and paralyzing, suddenly turned hot and white with rage. This object had made my sanctuary into a torture chamber, and I wasn't going to take it for another second. No, I said out loud, my voice raw. The sound of it surprised me. No more. I threw the blanket off and stood up. My legs were stiff. I didn't have a plan, not really. All I knew was that I had to get the source of that noise out of my apartment. Out of my life. I wasn't going to try to open it. I wasn't going to try to break it. I was just going to remove it. I marched over to the desk, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs that seemed to sync up with the frantic scratching. Skritch scritch scree scree scritch. It was louder up close, a genuinely maddening noise that made me want to cover my ears and scream. I didn't. I just reached out with both hands, grabbed the dense, heavy box, and lifted it off the desk. I was going to run. I was going to unwedge the chair, unlock the door, run down the 3 flights of stairs, and hurl this cursed thing into the big metal dumpster in the alley. Let the garbage men deal with it. I didn't care. I held it tight against my chest, turned, and took a step toward the door. Skritch scritch scritch scree. I froze. My blood went ice cold. It felt like my entire circulatory system had just shut down. I was holding the box. It was pressed firmly against my ribs, heavy and solid. My fingers were wrapped around the carved wood, but the sound hadn't moved. It was just as loud, just as frantic, and it was still coming from, over there. From the corner of the room, near the front door. My brain couldn't process it. It was like watching a movie where the sound is out of sync with the picture. I was holding the thing that was making the noise, but the noise was somewhere else. It didn't make any sense. My mind scrambled for an explanation. An echo? Was the sound just that loud, that it was bouncing off the walls, making it seem like it was coming from everywhere? Slowly, almost involuntarily, I lowered the box and held it at arm's length. The desperate scratching continued, unabated, from the direction of the door. I looked down at the wooden object in my hands. It was inert, lifeless, just a block of carved wood. Still moving like I was underwater, I brought the box up to my ear. I pressed my cheek against the cool, polished surface, blocking out all other sound. I listened. Nothing. Not a vibration. Not a hum. Not the faintest whisper of movement from within. It was as silent as a stone. A wave of nausea washed over me. I let out a shaky breath and slowly, deliberately, turned my head, keeping the silent box held up near one ear while my other ear aimed at the source of the noise. And I heard it clearly for what it was. Skrrk. Scrape. Tink. It wasn't wood. It wasn't claws. It was metal, a thin piece of metal, scraping against other metal. It was a delicate, precise, methodical sound. It wasn't the sound of an animal trying to get out. It was the sound of a person trying to get in. The truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. I stumbled back a step, my legs suddenly weak. It all clicked into place, every single confusing, terrifying detail of the last 3 days, forming a picture so horrible I wanted to claw my own eyes out. The box was a trick. It was a distraction, a piece of psychological warfare. The note, "Don't open," wasn't a warning, it was a hook. It was designed to prey on curiosity, to make me bring it inside. To make me focus on it. The scratching sounds I'd imagined the first night, they were probably real, but they weren't from the box. They were from him, his first tentative attempts at my lock. The scratch on the brass faceplate wasn't from my fumbling keys. It was from his tools slipping. He'd been out there, every night. Standing in my hallway, working on my lock, while I was inside, terrified of a wooden box. He had used my own imagination against me. He had listened. He must have heard me trying to pry it open last night, heard me pacing, and known his trick was working perfectly. He knew I was distracted. He knew I was scared of the wrong thing. He knew I wouldn't call the police about a noisy antique. He had been playing with me. A cat, batting a mouse back and forth before the kill. And the frantic, desperate sound tonight, that was him making his final push, knowing I'd be so focused on the boxes, crescendo, that I wouldn't hear the delicate, final work on the lock itself. I was a fool, an idiot, sitting barricaded on the couch, watching a silent, empty box, while the real monster was on the other side of the door, just inches away, picking my life apart. The metallic scraping from the door continued. Scrape, tink, skrrk, a patient, rhythmic, practiced sound. And then it stopped. The silence that fell was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It was absolute, complete, a void where the sound of my impending doom had just been. In that dead silence, a new sound bloomed. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but in the hyper-aware state I was in, it sounded like a cannon shot. Click. It was the sound of a deadbolt tumbler falling into place. The sound of a lock being opened. For a second, there was no time. The universe was contained in that single, final click. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was a sound of finality, of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was the sound of a key I didn't own, turning a lock I could no longer trust. My entire world, which just a moment ago had been spinning with the horrifying realization of the trick, came to a dead stop. I was a statue, made of ice and dread, my hand still clutching the cold, silent wooden box. The box. The stupid, worthless box. He had played me. He had sat out there in the hallway, night after night, a patient spider, while I, the fly, was busy panicking about a splinter of wood. He'd listened to my fear, probably. Maybe he'd even smiled, hearing me scrape and pry at his little decoy while he worked on the real prize. The thought sent a jolt of something colder than fear through me. It was a violation so profound it felt physical, like a hand reaching inside my chest and squeezing my heart. My breath was gone. I wasn't holding it, it had simply left my body, and I didn't know how to call it back. My eyes were locked on the door, on the small brass doorknob that had always represented safety. Now, it was the focal point of all the horror in the world. And then, it began to turn. It moved with an unnatural slowness. A deliberate, silent rotation that spoke of confidence, of someone who knew there was no need to hurry. There was no rattle, no creak of old metal. It was a smooth, oiled turn, the kind of movement you see in a high-budget movie, not in a third-floor apartment in a building older than my parents'. The deadbolt was already open. This was the latch. This was the last barrier. My brain was a blank, white screen. All the complex thoughts, the anger, the realization from moments before, gone. Wiped clean. All that was left was a single, flashing imperative: he is coming in. The door began to open. A thin, vertical line of deeper blackness appeared in the gap between the door and the frame. The darkness of the hallway. It widened, inch by agonizing inch, a slow-motion nightmare unfolding 6 feet from where I stood. I was still holding the box. My knuckles were white. I could feel the intricate carvings pressing into my palm, a mocking reminder of my own stupidity. Every instinct screamed at me to do something. Scream, run, throw the box. But my feet were bolted to the floor. My throat was sealed shut. This is what it feels like, I thought, in some distant, analytical part of my brain that was still functioning. This is what it feels like to be prey. To know the predator is here and to be able to do nothing but watch it approach. A shape began to resolve itself in that widening gap. The silhouette of a man. Tall, broader than the doorframe seemed to allow. And that's what broke the spell. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't a surge of bravery. It was something deeper, something animal. The sight of that physical form preparing to step into my space, my home, my sanctuary, flipped a switch. The white screen in my head went red. The paralysis shattered, and a hot, blinding surge of adrenaline shot through me like lightning. I didn't scream. A scream was a signal of fear, a confirmation for him that his victim was right where she was supposed to be. I dropped the wooden box. It hit the rug with a soft, unsatisfying thud. I didn't even watch it fall. My body was already moving, pivoting on one heel, not toward the back of the apartment, but sideways. Into my bedroom. My eyes scanned the room in the half-second it took me to cross the threshold, my brain working faster than it ever had in my life. The window? No, 3 floors up. The closet? A trap. The bed? Useless. Then I saw it, on the nightstand, my bedside lamp. It wasn't much, just a cheap thing I'd bought at a thrift store. But its base was heavy, a solid chunk of glazed ceramic, a pale blue color. It was dense. It was a weapon. My hand closed around the cool, smooth base. I ripped it from the nightstand, the plug pulling from the wall socket with a little pop. The cord tangled around my wrist. I didn't care. I spun around and lunged back out of the bedroom, not into the line of sight of the door, but to the side. I pressed my back flat against the wall, the section of wall right next to the entryway. The place you can't see when you first step inside. I was a breath away from the open doorway, hidden in plain sight. I held the lamp base in both hands, an awkward, makeshift club, and lifted it high beside my head. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so violent I was sure he could hear it. My breath came in shallow, silent gasps. I was no longer in. I was a cornered animal, coiled and ready to strike. The world narrowed to this one single act. The shadow filled the doorway. He stepped inside. He was just as silent as the door had been. He moved with a practiced grace that was terrifying. He was big, dressed in dark clothing, a black beanie pulled low on his forehead. He took one step into my apartment and then, with a soft click, he pushed the door gently closed behind him, but didn't latch it. He was trapping us in here together. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, and his head was turned, his attention completely fixed on the living room to his left. He was looking for the box. For his trophy. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound he'd been faking, confident that the person who lived here was either asleep or cowering under her covers, petrified by his little game. He hadn't seen me. He hadn't heard me. In his mind, he was a ghost. He was in complete control. He took another step, moving past the wall I was hiding behind. His back was to me for a fraction of a second. It was everything I needed. A sound tore from my throat, a guttural, half-choked roar that had no words in it. It was the sound of pure, undiluted rage and terror. I launched myself off the wall, all my weight, all my fear, all my fury pouring into that one single motion. I swung the lamp base like I was trying to hit a home run out of the park. Time slowed down again. I saw the lamp arcing through the dim light. I saw the side of his head, the space just above his ear, his temple, turning slightly toward the sound of my cry. He was too slow. The ceramic base connected with a sound I will never, ever forget. It wasn't the sharp crack you hear in movies. It was a dense, wet, sickening thump. It was the sound of something solid hitting something soft that wasn't supposed to give. I felt the impact shudder all the way up my arms to my shoulders, a horrible, jarring vibration. The lamp base shattered in my hands, sharp pieces of ceramic digging into my fingers, but I barely registered the pain. The man made a noise, a short, surprised grunt, like the air being forced out of him. He didn't cry out. He didn't even turn fully. He just stopped. His body went rigid for a long second, and then he staggered, one step, two, his legs suddenly uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. He brought a hand up to the side of his head, slowly, almost curiously. And then he just folded. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the floor, his head hitting the hardwood with a second, hollow thud. He landed in a heap, motionless. I stood there, gasping, my chest heaving. The broken neck of the lamp was still in my hands. The lampshade was on the floor next to him, tilted like a sad, broken hat. The air smelled of ozone from the broken bulb and something else, something coppery and hot. I looked at the crumpled form on my floor. Is he dead? Unconscious? My mind couldn't process it. My ears were ringing. The only thought that formed was, he's in my house. The paralysis returned for a moment, the sheer, overwhelming reality of what had just happened. A man was on my floor. I had put him there. I looked at my hands, at the blood welling up from the cuts from the broken ceramic, my blood, mixing with, was that his? And then the next wave of adrenaline hit. Not the rage. This was pure, panicked flight. I dropped what was left of the lamp. It clattered to the floor. And I screamed. This time, it was a real scream. A high, thin, piercing shriek of absolute terror that clawed its way out of my lungs. I didn't look at him again. I couldn't. I just turned, lunged for the door he had so kindly left unlatched, wrenched it open, and threw myself out into the hallway. I didn't run. I fell down the stairs. My feet barely seemed to touch the steps as I scrambled and stumbled my way down, my hands scraping against the rough texture of the hallway wall. My own screams echoed in the enclosed stairwell, a terrible, desperate sound. Help! Somebody help me, please! The third-floor landing gave way to the second, a blur of beige paint and closed doors. My lungs burned, my legs ached. I kept screaming, the words becoming a single, continuous wail. I flew around the turn for the final flight of stairs leading to the ground floor lobby. And I ran directly into a solid wall of human. Oof! The impact knocked the breath out of me. Strong hands grabbed my arms to steady me before I could fall the rest of the way down the stairs. My head snapped up. It was a man, my neighbor from 2B, Mr. Henderson. A quiet, older man who was usually coming home from a late shift at this hour. His face was a mask of confusion and alarm, his eyes wide. My brain couldn't form a coherent sentence. I just clung to the front of his work jacket, my fingers digging into the fabric. The screaming stopped, replaced by ragged, sobbing gasps. "Police," I choked out, my voice a raw, shredded thing. "Call the police. My apartment. I couldn't finish. I couldn't say it. I just pointed frantically back up the stairs, back toward the darkness I had just fled. Mr. Henderson's eyes followed my shaking finger up into the silent stairwell. From where we stood, we could just see my front door at the top of the landing. It was still wide open, a perfect, black rectangle, gaping into the night, silent and waiting. For a long moment we just stood there, a strange tableau on the second-floor landing. Me, a mess of snot and tears and terror, clinging to Mr. Henderson's work jacket like a life raft. Him, frozen, staring up the stairs at the black rectangle of my open doorway. The silence from my apartment was suddenly more terrifying than my own screaming had been. "What? Who?" Mr. Henderson's voice was low, careful. He was a good man. I could see the conflict on his face, the instinct to help, weighed against the very sensible fear of walking up those stairs. "Police," I managed to croak out again. My throat felt like it was full of shredded glass. Call the police." He didn't hesitate. He pulled his phone from his pocket with his free hand, his other still steadying my arm. His thumb, surprisingly nimble for a man his age, jabbed at the screen. I couldn't hear what he said to the 911 operator. My own blood was roaring in my ears, a high-pitched ringing that blotted out everything else. I just kept my eyes fixed on his face, watching his expression shift from alarm to a grim sort of resolve as he relayed what little information he had. He hung up. They're on their way. 5 minutes, maybe less. He looked at me, then back up the stairs. Is he still in there? I realized I didn't know. The image of him crumpling to the floor was burned into my mind, but that was a whole lifetime ago. 30 seconds? A minute? He could be getting up. He could be waiting just inside the door. The thought sent a fresh jolt of ice through my veins. I shook my head, a frantic, jerky motion. I didn't know anything. I just wanted to be as far away from that door as possible. We didn't wait on the landing. Mr. Henderson guided me, my legs feeling like they were made of wet cement, down the final flight of stairs and into the brightly lit, sterile lobby. The sudden fluorescence felt like an assault after the dim stairwell. He sat me down on the little bench by the mailboxes. I just hunched over, my arms wrapped around myself, shivering even though the lobby was warm. The siren started as a distant cry and grew to a deafening wail in what felt like seconds. Red and blue lights flashed through the glass front doors, painting the lobby in frantic, strobing colors. 2 uniformed officers came through the door first, hands resting near their hips, their faces all business. Mr. Henderson met them, pointing back up the stairs, his voice a low, urgent murmur. I watched them go, their heavy boots thudding on the linoleum and then echoing up the concrete stairs. A paramedic came over and tried to talk to me, a young woman with kind eyes. She asked if I was hurt. I vaguely registered the small, stinging cuts on my fingers from the broken lamp and the raw scrape on my arm from tumbling down the stairs, but I couldn't speak. I just shook my head. The injuries felt like they belonged to someone else. The real wound wasn't visible. I sat there, listening. I expected shouting. I expected a struggle, a gunshot, something, but there was nothing, only a tense, awful silence from the 3rd floor. It stretched on for an eternity. After what must have been 10 minutes, one of the officers came back down. He was holding the little wooden box in a gloved hand. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, professional. "There's no one up there." The words didn't compute. "What? The apartment is empty. Your attacker is gone. Looks like he went out the back fire escape. Did you see which way he went?" I just stared at him, dumbfounded. Gone? How? He was on the floor. I saw him fall. I heard his head hit the wood. The officer's radio crackled, and he spoke into it, his voice dropping. I caught fragments. Small amount of blood on the floor, entry toolkit by the door, professional. The paramedic wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. It was coarse and smelled of disinfectant. Another officer, a detective in a rumpled suit, came and sat next to me. He asked me to tell him everything, from the beginning. And so, in a flat, monotone voice that didn't feel like my own, I told him. I told him about the box. The note, the scratching sounds, the slow, dawning horror of realizing it wasn't the box, but the door. The final click, the lamp, the sickening thud, everything. He listened patiently, taking notes in a little book. When I finished, he just looked at me for a long time. "You did good, In," he said, using my first name. It was jarring. "You did everything right, you fought back, and you got out. Most people freeze." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they just made me feel hollow. He was gone. He had gotten into my home, my safe space, and I had fought him and he had still gotten away. He was out there, somewhere in the city, and he knew where I lived. He knew what the inside of my apartment looked like. He knew the color of my stupid nightstand. The thought made me want to throw up. I couldn't go back there. Not that night. The detective, Miller was his name, understood. I called my friend Sarah, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. She didn't even ask questions, just heard the sound of my voice and said, "I'm on my way." The next few days were a blur of shock and paperwork. I stayed on Sarah's couch, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, starting at every sound. The creak of the floorboards in her apartment, the slam of a car door on the street below, the jingle of her keys in the lock. Each noise sent a spike of panic straight through my chest. My apartment wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. A place I couldn't imagine ever sleeping in again. It was contaminated, violated. Sarah was amazing. She brought me tea, made sure I ate something, and just sat with me when I couldn't stop crying. She screened my calls. She talked to the building manager. She was a rock, but at night when she was asleep and the apartment was dark and quiet, the thoughts would come. I'd see his silhouette in the doorway. I'd feel the jarring impact of the lamp in my hands. And I'd hear that awful, wet thud. Over and over. Why me? Was it random? Was he just a common burglar who I'd had the terrible luck of surprising? It didn't feel right. The box, the sounds, the whole elaborate deception, it felt personal. It felt like a game. It was on the fourth day that Detective Miller called. I was sitting at Sarah's kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. And Vance? It was his voice, the calm, professional tone. "Yes, this is she, Detective Miller. Just wanted to give you an update. We haven't had any luck identifying our suspect from the blood sample yet. The DNA database came up empty. But I wanted to let you know we managed to get into that wooden box you found." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The box. I'd almost forgotten about it. "Oh," I said, "what was in it? A clockwork mechanism? Something that made the sound?" I was desperate for a rational explanation, something to make sense of the past week. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was just a second or two, but it felt heavy. When he spoke again, his professional calm had a slight crack in it. "No, Anne," he said slowly. "There was nothing in it that could have made any kind of sound. No mechanics at all." Then, what was inside? I could hear him take a slow breath, like he was steeling himself to say the next words. "Look, it's a little strange." The box was full of trophies. "Keepsakes." "Keepsakes?" "Little locks of hair," he said, and the words hit me like a splash of ice water. Dozens of them, all different colors. Each one was tied with a tiny, neat little ribbon. I couldn't breathe. I shut my eyes, my hand tightening on the phone. Hair. My mind reeled. Why would anyone? "That's not all," Miller continued, his voice even lower now, as if he was afraid of being overheard. Next to each lock of hair, there was a photograph. A Polaroid picture. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. "They were pictures of women," he said. "They were all asleep, in their own beds, in their own homes. The pictures were taken from inside their rooms, from the foot of the bed or from a doorway. He got in, watched them sleep, took a picture, took a lock of their hair, and then he left. Without them ever knowing he was there." The coffee cup slipped from my other hand, hitting the floor and shattering. Hot coffee splashed across my bare feet, but I didn't feel it. A monster. He wasn't a burglar. He was a collector, a ghost who slipped into the safest places in people's lives and took pieces of them. The box was his collection, his museum of violations. "Anne, are you still there?" Detective Miller's voice sounded very far away. "Yes," I whispered. My own voice was a stranger's. He hesitated again. "And there's one more thing. At the very bottom of the box, there was an empty space. Waiting for the next one, I guess. In that space, there was a new, blank Polaroid. The film hadn't been exposed yet. And next to it, there was a small, coiled-up piece of ribbon." He paused, and I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the grave, what he was going to say next. I knew it before the words ever left his mouth. It was a kind of teal color, he said, his voice laced with a quiet sort of horror. Like a blue-green. I didn't need to be in my apartment to see it. In my mind's eye, I saw my bedroom. I saw the bed where he thought I would be sleeping. And I saw the new curtains I had just bought last month, the ones I was so proud of, hanging by the window. They were a deep, beautiful teal. The phone slid from my fingers and clattered onto the tiled floor. He hadn't just been picking my lock for 3 nights. He had been inside before. He had been in my room while I was sleeping. He had stood there, in the dark, watching me. He had chosen the ribbon. He hadn't come to steal my things. He'd come to steal a piece of me for his collection. And he had left the box for me to find, a taunt, an overture to his sick, patient game. The game wasn't over. He had failed this time, but a collector like that, a hunter, they don't just give up.